The October wind cut through the Colorado mountains like a blade, carrying with it the scent of pine and the promise of an early winter. Sarah McKenna pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stepped onto the porch of her log cabin, the weathered boards creaking beneath her feet. 3 years had passed since consumption had claimed her husband Thomas, leaving her alone in this wilderness that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. She had grown accustomed to the solitude, finding comfort in the rhythm of her daily routines, tending her small garden, preserving vegetables for winter, mending clothes by candlelight. The nearest settlement, Copper Creek, lay a hard day's ride through treacherous mountain passes, but Sarah preferred the isolation. Here, among the towering pines and granite peaks, she could grieve in peace. The sound that broke the morning stillness was subtle at first, a low groan carried on the wind, almost indistinguishable from the creaking of tree branches. Sarah paused, her hand on the water bucket she'd been about to fill from the well. There it was again, unmistakably human, coming from the direction of the creek that ran behind her property. Setting down the bucket, she walked carefully through the tall grass, her brown boots crunching on fallen leaves. The aspens had turned golden, their branches creating a canopy of amber light that danced across the forest floor. As she pushed through a thicket of serviceberry bushes, her breath caught in her throat. A man lay face down near the creek's edge, his long black hair spread across the rocky ground like spilled ink. His bronze skin was slick with sweat despite the cool morning air, and a wooden arrow protruded from his left shoulder, its fletching stained with blood. He wore buckskin leggings and a vest decorated with intricate beadwork, now torn and muddied from his ordeal. Sarah's first instinct was to run. Every story she'd heard about Indian raids flashed through her mind, tales of scalping, burning cabins, women carried off into captivity. But as she watched him struggle to lift his head, his dark eyes meeting hers with a mixture of pain and resignation, something deeper than fear stirred within her chest. "Please," he whispered in accented English, his voice barely audible above the babbling creek. "Water." She stood frozen for a moment, torn between compassion and caution. This man could be a scout for a war party, she told herself. He could be dangerous, but the rational part of her mind observed his condition, the fever flush in his cheeks, the way his body trembled with exhaustion, the amount of blood that had soaked into the earth beneath him. He was dying. "Don't move," she said softly, though she wasn't sure if she was reassuring him or herself. I'll get help." "No help," he managed, shaking his head weakly. They come for me. You run." Sarah looked around the clearing, half expecting to see painted warriors emerging from the tree line, but there was only the whisper of wind through the pines and the gentle murmur of water over stones. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out, its voice echoing off the canyon walls. Making a decision that would change her life forever, Sarah knelt beside him. "I'm not running," she said firmly, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. "And I'm not letting you die here." The warrior's eyes widened slightly, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. Up close, she could see that he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps in his late 20s, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw. A thin scar ran from his left temple to his ear, and intricate tattoos marked his chest and arms. Despite his weakened state, there was something noble about his bearing, a quiet dignity that commanded respect. "My name is Sarah," she said, gently rolling him onto his side to examine the arrow wound. "What's yours?" He hesitated, studying her face with those penetrating dark eyes. "Takoda," he finally whispered. "It means friend to everyone." Sarah almost smiled at the irony. Here she was, an Irish widow living alone on the frontier, tending to a Lakota warrior who claimed to be everyone's friend. If the folks in Copper Creek could see her now, they'd think she'd lost her mind. "Well, Takoda," she said, testing the unfamiliar name on her tongue. "Friend to everyone is about to become the responsibility of one very stubborn Irish woman. Think you can make it to my cabin if I help you?" The effort of nodding seemed to drain what little strength he had left, but he managed it. Sarah looked at the arrow again, knowing that moving him with it still in place could cause more damage. But leaving him here wasn't an option, not with winter approaching and whoever had shot him potentially still in the area. She slipped her arm under his good shoulder, feeling the heat of fever radiating from his skin. "On 3, she said. 1, 2. Takoda gritted his teeth and pushed himself up with his remaining strength, leaning heavily against her as they stumbled toward the cabin. Each step seemed to take an eternity, and by the time they reached her porch, both of them were breathing hard. Sarah's dress was stained with his blood, and her arms ached from supporting his weight. Inside the one-room cabin, she helped him onto her bed, the rope springs creaking under his weight. The arrow had shifted during their journey, and fresh blood seeped through his vest. Takoda's face had gone grey, and his eyes fluttered closed. "Stay with me," Sarah said urgently, touching his cheek. His skin was burning with fever. "Don't you dare die in my bed, Takoda. I've got enough ghosts in here already." As she gathered her medical supplies, what little she had, Sarah couldn't help but wonder what she was doing. She was a simple widow, not a doctor. She'd tended her husband during his final illness, but this was different. This was a man who belonged to a world she didn't understand, a culture that had been painted as savage and dangerous by every newspaper and politician from here to Washington. But as she looked at him lying unconscious in her bed, all she saw was a human being in need of help. Tomorrow, she would worry about the consequences. Tonight, she would do everything in her power to keep him alive. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's windows like fingers testing the locks. And somewhere in the darkness beyond her small circle of lamplight, Sarah had the strangest feeling they were being watched. Sarah had never removed an arrow from a man's body, but she'd pulled plenty of splinters from Thomas's hands during their years together, and she approached this task with the same methodical care. By the light of 3 oil lamps, she examined the wooden shaft that had pierced Takoda's shoulder just below the collarbone. The arrowhead had gone clean through, emerging slightly from his back. A blessing, she realized, as it meant she wouldn't have to dig for it. "This is going to hurt," she whispered, though he remained unconscious. His breathing was shallow but steady, and the fever seemed to have stabilized for now. She'd managed to get some willow bark tea into him earlier, hoping it would help with both the pain and the fever. Sarah had spent the afternoon preparing. She'd boiled water, torn clean strips from one of her cotton petticoats for bandages, and sterilized her late husband's hunting knife in the flames of her cooking fire. The cabin smelled of carbolic acid, a precious bottle she'd been saving for emergencies, and the bitter scent of medicinal herbs. With steady hands, she cut away the beadwork vest, revealing the full extent of his injuries. Besides the arrow wound, Takoda bore other marks, older scars that spoke of a life lived dangerously, and fresh bruises that suggested he'd been in a fight before being shot. His chest rose and fell rhythmically, and Sarah found herself studying the tattoos that marked his skin. They weren't random designs, but seemed to tell a story she couldn't read. "Forgive me," she murmured, gripping the arrow shaft firmly. With one swift motion, she snapped off the fletched end, leaving just enough wood to grasp on the other side. Takoda's body tensed, and a low groan escaped his lips, but he didn't wake. The hardest part came next. Sarah moved to his back, positioned herself carefully, and began to work the arrowhead through. Blood welled up around the wound, and she had to pause twice to wipe her hands clean. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the arrow came free with a wet sound that made her stomach lurch. "There," she said aloud, as much to comfort herself as him. "The worst is over." She cleaned both wounds thoroughly with the carbolic acid, causing Takoda to arch his back and cry out in his native language. The sound was anguished, but somehow musical, like a prayer or a song of pain. Sarah found herself murmuring back to him in Gaelic, words her grandmother had taught her, meant to soothe and heal. As she worked, stitching the wounds closed with neat, careful sutures, Sarah became aware of a presence outside, not threatening exactly, but watchful. She glanced toward the window several times, seeing nothing but darkness beyond the glass, yet the feeling persisted, the sense of being observed by unseen eyes. "Your people?" she asked Takoda softly as she tied off the last stitch. "Are they out there watching over you?" His eyes fluttered open, unfocused but aware. "Sarah," he whispered, remembering her name. The simple fact that he'd retained it through the fever and pain sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. "I'm here," she said, reaching for a cool cloth to wipe the sweat from his brow. "The arrow's out. You're going to be fine." "Why?" His voice was stronger now, though still weak. "Why help me?" Sarah paused in her ministrations, considering the question. It was one she'd been asking herself all day. "Because you needed help," she said simply. "And because—" She hesitated, then decided on honesty. "Because when I looked at you, I didn't see an enemy. I saw a man in pain." Takoda studied her face in the lamplight, those dark eyes seeming to see straight through to her soul. "Your husband?" he asked, noticing the simple gold band she still wore. "Dead 3 years now," Sarah replied, surprised by how easily she spoke of it. She rarely mentioned Thomas to anyone. Consumption took him. I am sorry. The words were formal, but the sympathy in his voice was genuine. It is hard to lose the one who shares your heart. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes, not of sadness but of recognition. Here was someone who understood loss, who spoke of love with the reverence it deserved. Yes, she whispered, it is. Over the next 2 days, Takoda's strength gradually returned. Sarah helped him sit up to drink broth, changed his bandages twice daily, and watched for signs of infection. They spoke little at first. He seemed wary of revealing too much about himself, and she respected his caution. But gradually, small confidences began to emerge. She learned that he was Lakota, from a band that followed the old ways, living in the traditional manner despite the pressure to move to the reservations. His English came from 2 years spent at a mission school as a boy, an experience he described with a mixture of gratitude and resentment. They tried to kill the Indian in me, he said on the second evening, accepting a cup of sassafras tea from her hands. Cut my hair, forbade my language, told me my people's ways were savage, but they taught me to read your words, to understand your world. Perhaps that was their gift, even if they did not mean it as one. What brought you here? Sarah asked. To my land, I mean. You're far from Lakota territory. Takoda's expression darkened. Running, he said simply. My band. We refused to sign the new treaty, refused to go to the agency. The blue coats came with papers and guns. Some of our young men fought back. He touched his shoulder gingerly. I was scouting ahead when the soldiers found me. The arrow came from one of my own people, a reservation Indian, working as their tracker. Your own people shot you? Sarah couldn't hide her shock. The white man's gold speaks loudly to hungry bellies, Takoda said bitterly. He knew if he killed me, there would be one less to lead our people away from the agency, one less voice speaking against surrender. Sarah felt a surge of anger on his behalf, followed immediately by guilt. These were her people, white settlers and soldiers, who had driven him to this desperate flight. I'm sorry, she said, for what my people have done to yours. Takoda looked at her with surprise, then something like respect. You are not responsible for the choices of others, Sarah McKenna, just as I am not responsible for every raid, every burned cabin, every scalp taken by warriors whose pain has turned them cruel. On the third morning, Sarah woke to find Takoda sitting up in bed, staring out the window at the dawn. His color had improved dramatically, and the fever had broken completely during the night. But there was something different about him now, a restlessness, an awareness that their strange sanctuary couldn't last forever. They're still out there, he said without turning around. My people, watching, waiting to see what you will do with me. Sarah joined him at the window, following his gaze to the tree line. For a moment, she saw nothing. Then a slight movement caught her eye, the briefest glimpse of a horse and rider, there and gone again like a shadow. Are you afraid of them? She asked. No, Takoda replied, but they are afraid for me, and perhaps afraid of what is happening between us. Sarah's breath caught. There it was, spoken aloud, the thing that had been growing between them over these 3 days of intimate care, of quiet conversations and shared silences. She had felt it in the way his eyes followed her movements around the cabin, in the gentleness of his voice when he spoke her name, in the way her heart raced when she changed his bandages and their skin touched. What is happening between us? She asked softly. Takoda turned to face her, and she saw her own confusion and wonder reflected in his dark eyes. I do not know, he admitted. In my world, there are words for what a man feels when a woman shows him kindness. But this feels like something more dangerous. Dangerous? Because, he said, reaching out to touch her hand with his fingertips, if I stay much longer, I will not want to leave. And if I do not leave soon, staying may cost us both more than we can bear to pay. Outside, a hawk circled overhead, its cry sharp and wild in the mountain air. And in the distance, barely visible among the pines, Sarah caught another glimpse of the watchers, silent guardians of a man whose healing had become something neither of them had expected. By the 4th day, Takoda was strong enough to sit outside on Sarah's porch, wrapped in one of Thomas's old wool blankets. The October sun felt warm on his face, and the mountain air carried the scent of wood smoke from Sarah's chimney as she prepared their morning meal. She had insisted he needed fresh air and sunlight to complete his healing, though they both knew his wounds were mending remarkably well. Sarah emerged from the cabin, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee, a luxury she rarely indulged in, but had decided this morning called for something special. She handed one to Takoda and settled into the wooden chair beside him, noting how natural it felt to share this simple domestic moment. "Tell me about your life before," she said, watching steam rise from her cup. "Before all this trouble with the soldiers." Takoda was silent for so long that Sarah wondered if she'd overstepped some boundary. Then he began to speak, his voice soft and measured. "We followed the buffalo herds, lived as our grandfathers lived. I was training to be a medicine man under my uncle's guidance. Not a war chief, not a hunter of men, a healer." He smiled ruefully. "Strange that I should find myself here, being healed by a white woman after being shot by my own people." "A medicine man," Sarah repeated, intrigued. "So you understand healing arts?" "Some. Enough to know that you saved my life with your skill." He turned to look at her directly. "The spirits work in mysterious ways, bringing a wounded healer to the door of one who has the power to mend what is broken." Sarah felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. "I'm no expert. I just did what seemed right. That is often the beginning of true wisdom." They sat in comfortable silence, watching a pair of eagles soar above the canyon. The morning was crystalline clear, the kind of day that made the mountains seem close enough to touch. Sarah found herself stealing glances at Takoda's profile, noting the strong line of his jaw, the way the sunlight caught the copper tones in his skin. "Sarah," he said suddenly, "there is something I must tell you. About why I cannot stay much longer." Her stomach tightened with dread, though she'd known this moment would come. "What is it?" "My people, the ones watching from the trees, they are not just guards, they are messengers. Word has come that the soldiers are moving this way, searching for me and any others who refuse the treaty. If they find me here—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. "What would happen to me?" Sarah asked, surprising herself with how calmly she posed the question. "At best, you would be seen as a collaborator. At worst—" Takoda's jaw tightened. "There are men in your army who believe the only good Indian is a dead one, and they extend that belief to anyone who helps us." Sarah set down her coffee cup with a steady hand, though her heart was racing. "Then we'd better make sure they don't find you here." "We?" Takoda turned to stare at her. "Sarah, you don't understand what you're saying. If you help me escape, there will be no coming back from that choice. Your life here, your safety—" "My life here is half a life," Sarah interrupted, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I've been existing, not living, going through the motions of survival while feeling nothing, caring about nothing, hoping for nothing." She met his gaze boldly. "These past few days, caring for you, talking with you, I feel alive again for the first time since Thomas died." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross. Takoda reached out slowly, his fingertips barely brushing her cheek. "And I have found something I thought was lost to me forever," he said quietly. "Hope." Sarah leaned into his touch, closing her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, she saw her own longing reflected in his dark gaze. "What are we doing, Takoda?" "Something foolish," he admitted, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. "Something dangerous, something that could destroy us both. And yet I find I cannot bring myself to care about the consequences." His voice was rough with emotion. 3 years ago, when the cholera took my wife and infant son, I thought my heart had died with them. I became a man going through the motions of living, just as you said, but you—" He cupped her face in both hands now. "You make me remember what it feels like to want a future." Sarah's breath caught. She hadn't known about his losses, hadn't realized they shared this bond of grief. "You lost a family, as did you in your way." His forehead touched hers, and they stayed that way for a long moment, breathing the same air, sharing the same space. Perhaps that is why the spirits brought us together, two broken people learning to be whole again. The sound of hoofbeats in the distance broke the spell. They pulled apart, both instantly alert. Sarah could see 3 riders approaching through the trees. Not soldiers, but men from Copper Creek by the look of their clothes and horses. "Inside," Sarah said urgently. "Quickly." But Takoda was already moving, his warrior's instincts overriding his injuries. Within seconds he had gathered the blanket and disappeared into the cabin's dim interior. Sarah took a moment to compose herself, smoothing her hair and wiping any trace of tears from her cheeks. The riders emerged into her clearing just as she stood up from her chair. She recognized them immediately. Jake Morrison, the town's self-appointed sheriff, his deputy, a nervous young man named Pete Collins, and Bob Henley, who owned the general store and had always made her skin crawl with his leering looks. "Morning, Mrs. McKenna," Morrison called out, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that was more mockery than courtesy. He was a big man with a gut stretching his vest and small, cruel eyes. Mind if we water our horses at your creek? Of course not, Sarah replied, though every instinct screamed danger. What brings you up this way, Mr. Morrison? Looking for an Indian, Henley said, spitting tobacco juice into her yard. Wounded Lakota, probably armed and dangerous. Army's got word he's hiding somewhere in these hills. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her voice steady. An Indian up here. I haven't seen anyone but you three in weeks. Morrison's eyes narrowed as he studied her cabin, taking in the clean-swept porch, the curtains in the windows, the general air of domestic tranquility. Funny thing, Mrs. McKenna. Tracker says his trail leads right up this canyon, ends somewhere around here. Trackers can be wrong, Sarah said mildly, especially when they're following old sign. Animals use these same paths. Maybe so. Morrison dismounted, and Sarah had to force herself not to step backward. But the Army's offering a $50 reward for information leading to his capture. That's a lot of money for a woman living alone. $50 was indeed a fortune, more than Sarah saw in 6 months of selling eggs and preserves to Copper Creek. The men were watching her carefully, gauging her reaction to the offer. I appreciate you letting me know, she said. I'll certainly keep my eyes open. Collins, the young deputy, was staring at something near the porch steps. Sarah followed his gaze and felt her blood turn to ice. There, partially hidden by a clump of grass, was a single bead from Takoda's vest, bright blue and white, unmistakably Indian in origin. Say, Mrs. McKenna, Collins said slowly, that's a pretty bead there. Don't suppose you know where it came from? Sarah's mind raced. If she claimed ignorance, they might become suspicious. If she acknowledged it, she needed a plausible explanation. Oh, that, she said with what she hoped was the right amount of casual interest. I found it by the creek yesterday. Thought it was pretty, so I picked it up. Was planning to string it with some others for a necklace. Morrison bent down and retrieved the bead, rolling it between his thick fingers. Lakota work, he said with certainty. Fresh, too. This wasn't dropped by some passing trader months ago. The silence stretched like a taut rope. Sarah could feel sweat beading between her shoulder blades despite the cool mountain air. Inside the cabin, she prayed Takoda was staying absolutely still. Well, Morrison said finally, pocketing the bead, we'll be on our way, but Mrs. McKenna... He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath. If you see anything unusual, anything at all, you send word to town immediately. The Army doesn't take kindly to folks who harbor fugitives, even pretty widows. The threat was unmistakable. Sarah lifted her chin and met his gaze steadily. I understand perfectly, Mr. Morrison. After the men had watered their horses and ridden away, Sarah waited a full 10 minutes before entering the cabin. She found Takoda pressed against the wall beside the window, Thomas's hunting rifle in his good hand. They're gone, she whispered. Takoda lowered the rifle, but his expression remained grim. They will be back, and next time they will search the cabin. Sarah nodded, knowing he was right. The game had changed now. They were no longer just two people discovering unexpected feelings for each other. They were conspirators, bound together by the choice she had made to protect him and the choice he had made to trust her with his life. How long do we have? She asked. Until tomorrow night, perhaps. My people will come for me then, under cover of darkness. He set the rifle aside and took her hands in his. Sarah, it is not too late. You can still tell them you found me wounded and nursed me, but that I escaped in the night. No one would blame you for... No. Sarah's voice was firm. We're past that now. We're past pretending this is just about Christian charity or medical care. She squeezed his hands. I'm going with you. You don't know what you're saying. My people are heading north toward Canada. It will be a hard journey through winter mountains with soldiers pursuing us. Many will die before we reach safety. Then I'll die with you, Sarah said simply, because staying here, pretending none of this happened, would be a slower kind of death. Takoda searched her face for any sign of doubt or fear. What he found there made him pull her into his arms, holding her close, despite the protest from his healing shoulder. Then we have one day, he murmured against her hair. One day to say all the things we should have said, to share all the moments we should have shared. Outside, storm clouds were gathering over the peaks, and the wind carried the promise of snow. But inside the cabin, wrapped in each other's arms, Sarah and Takoda felt only the warmth of a love that had bloomed impossibly fast and burned impossibly bright, a love that would soon be tested by forces greater than either of them had ever faced. The storm arrived with the setting sun, bringing sheets of sleet that turned the world outside Sarah's cabin into a crystalline prison. She stood at the window, watching ice form on the pine branches, while Takoda prepared for what might be their last night together. His people would not come in weather like this. It would be too dangerous, too easily tracked. They would have to wait. "It's beautiful," Sarah murmured, tracing patterns in the frost on the glass, "and terrifying." Takoda joined her at the window, his arm slipping around her waist with a familiarity that felt both new and ancient. "My grandmother used to say that the spirits send storms when they want to give lovers time to speak their hearts," he said softly. Perhaps she was right. Sarah leaned back against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her shoulder. They had spent the day in careful preparation. She had packed what few belongings she could carry, including Thomas's rifle and ammunition, while Takoda had crafted new arrows from the wooden stakes of her garden fence. But now, with darkness falling and the storm raging outside, there was nothing left to do but wait. "Tell me about your wife," Sarah said quietly. "About your son." She felt Takoda stiffen slightly, but after a moment he began to speak. "Her name was Ayana, Eternal Blossom. We were childhood friends who became lovers, then husband and wife. She had a laugh like running water, always finding joy even in the hardest times." His voice grew softer. "Our son. He was barely walking when the sickness came. 10 months old, with his mother's eyes and my stubborn spirit." "What was his name?" "Chaitan, Little Falcon." Takoda's arms tightened around her. "I blamed myself for their deaths. Blamed the spirits, blamed the white man's diseases that our medicine could not cure. I became a man made of anger and grief, useful only for war." Sarah turned in his arms, studying his face in the firelight. "And now I remember what it means to hope for tomorrow instead of dwelling in yesterday." His hands framed her face with infinite gentleness. "You have given me back my heart, Sarah McKenna. I only pray I can keep it beating long enough to give you the life you deserve." "The life I deserve is whatever life we can build together," Sarah said fiercely. "I don't care if it's in a teepee on the plains, or a cabin in Canada, or a cave in the mountains, as long as we're together." The intensity in her voice seemed to break something loose in Takoda. He kissed her then desperately, hungrily, as if he could pour all his love and fear and hope into that single connection. Sarah responded with equal passion, her hands tangling in his long hair, her body pressing against his with an urgency that spoke of time running out. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "Sarah," Takoda whispered, his forehead resting against hers. "If we do this, if we truly become one, there will be no turning back. Not for either of us. I crossed that line 3 days ago when I chose to save your life instead of protecting my own," Sarah replied. "Everything since then has just been learning to live with the consequences." They made love as the storm raged outside, their bodies finding a rhythm as old as time itself. Sarah had forgotten what it felt like to be desired, to be cherished, to be seen as something more than just a widow surviving alone. In Takoda's arms, she rediscovered herself as a woman capable of passion, of joy, of love that burned bright enough to light the darkness. Afterward, they lay entwined before the fire, speaking in whispers about dreams and fears, about the journey ahead and the uncertain future they would face together. Sarah traced the scars on Takoda's chest while he wove her red hair through his fingers like silk. "In my language," he said, "there is a word, mitakuye oyasin. It means all my relations, but it's more than family. It means understanding that we are connected to everything, the earth, the sky, the animals, each other. When I first saw you kneeling beside the creek, I felt that connection, even though I didn't understand it then." "What do you understand now?" Sarah asked. "That some bonds transcend the boundaries men try to build between different worlds. That love is its own nation with its own laws." He pulled her closer. "And that I would rather die as your husband than live a lifetime without you." Sarah's breath caught. "Takoda, I know it cannot be legal in your world or mine, but here in this place between worlds, we can make our own vows." He sat up, taking her hands in his. "Sarah McKenna, will you be my wife in the eyes of the spirits who brought us together? Will you share my path, whatever it may lead?" Tears streamed down Sarah's cheeks as she looked into his eyes, seeing her own love reflected there. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Takoda, in this life, and whatever comes after." They spoke their vows by firelight, with only the storm as witness. Takoda braided a strand of her hair with his own, binding them together in the Lakota way, while Sarah placed her grandmother's silver ring, the only piece of jewelry she owned besides her wedding band, on his finger. "I wish we had more time," Sarah murmured, as they settled back into each other's arms. I wish we could have months, years to learn everything about each other. We will have a lifetime, Takoda said with quiet conviction. However long that lifetime proves to be. The storm began to subside near dawn, and with the clearing sky came the sound Sarah had been dreading, hoofbeats approaching through the melting sleet. But these were not the measured hooves of cavalry horses or the familiar gait of townsmen's mounts. These were Indian ponies, moving with the fluid grace of animals at one with their riders. Takoda was already up and dressed, checking his weapons. "They've come," he said simply. Sarah dressed quickly, pulling on her warmest clothes and shouldering the pack she'd prepared. At the last moment she grabbed Thomas's daguerreotype from the mantel, not out of sentiment, but because she couldn't bear the thought of Morrison or his men pouring through her possessions. Outside, 3 Lakota warriors waited in the pre-dawn gloom, their breath steaming in the cold air. They spoke to Takoda in rapid Lakota, their expressions grave. Sarah caught enough of their urgency to understand that soldiers were already on the move, less than a day behind. The leader, an older man with grey streaking his braids, looked at Sarah with undisguised skepticism. He spoke to Takoda again, his tone sharp with questions. "He asks why you would leave your comfortable life to follow the hard path of an exile," Takoda translated. "He worries that you will slow us down, that you will change your mind when you see what lies ahead." Sarah stepped forward, meeting the old warrior's gaze directly. "Tell him," she said clearly, "that I have already lost everything that mattered to me once. I will not make the same mistake twice." Takoda translated, adding words of his own that made the older man's eyebrows rise. After a moment, the leader nodded grudgingly and gestured toward a 4th horse they had brought, a sturdy mare with kind eyes and a gentle manner. "He says you may ride with us," Takoda said, "but if you cannot keep up, we will not wait. The lives of many depend on reaching Canada before the snow closes the passes." "I understand," Sarah replied, swinging up into the saddle with more confidence than she felt. She had ridden Thomas's horse regularly, but never on a journey like this. As they rode away from the cabin, Sarah looked back only once. The little log structure that had been her sanctuary for 3 years stood silent and empty, smoke still rising from the chimney. It looked smaller somehow, less significant than it had when it was her whole world. "Regrets?" Takoda asked, bringing his horse alongside hers. Sarah considered the question honestly. Behind them lay safety, predictability, the approval of her own people. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the possibility that her choice to follow love would cost them both their lives. "None," she said, and meant it. The sun broke through the clouds as they climbed higher into the mountains, and for a moment the world blazed with crystalline beauty, every ice-covered branch and snow-dusted peak lit with gold and rose. It was breathtaking and terrible, like the love that had brought them to this moment. Behind them, in the valley below, Sarah could make out tiny figures on horseback, soldiers following their trail with grim determination. The chase had begun in earnest, and there would be no mercy for any of them if they were caught. Sarah urged her horse forward, staying close to Takoda as they rode toward an uncertain future. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, and for the first time in 3 years, that was enough. 3 days of hard riding through treacherous mountain passes had brought them to the edge of the world Sarah had always known. The Canadian border lay somewhere beyond the next ridge, marked not by fences or signs, but by the promise of sanctuary that had drawn desperate people north for generations. Behind them, the pursuing soldiers had fallen back, their horses unable to match the endurance of Indian ponies on terrain that favored the hunted over the hunters. Sarah's body ached in places she'd forgotten existed, but her spirit soared with a freedom she had never imagined possible. She rode beside Takoda through landscapes of impossible beauty, crystal lakes that reflected snow-capped peaks, meadows carpeted with late-season wildflowers, forests so dense and ancient they seemed to whisper secrets older than human memory. The other warriors had gradually accepted her presence, particularly after she had proven herself during a treacherous river crossing on the 2nd day. When her horse had stumbled in the swift current, Sarah had managed to keep her seat and help guide 2 pack animals to safety, earning nods of approval from men who measured worth by action rather than words. "There," said Whitehawk, the eldest of their group, pointing toward a gap between 2 towering peaks. "Beyond that pass lies the land where the bluecoats cannot follow." But their triumph was premature. As they crested the final ridge before the border, the sight that greeted them sent ice through Sarah's veins. Spread across the valley below was a full cavalry patrol, 20 soldiers with fresh horses and a Gatling gun positioned to command the only feasible crossing point. A trap, Takoda said grimly. Someone told them which route we would take. Whitehawk spat into the snow. The tracker who shot you. He reads sign like his grandfather, but serves the white man's gold. Sarah studied the scene below with growing dread. The soldiers had chosen their position well. High ground, clear fields of fire, and the border tantalizingly close but impossibly distant. To reach Canada, they would have to cross nearly a mile of open ground under the guns of men who had orders to shoot to kill. There has to be another way, she said. Perhaps, Takoda replied, though his tone held little hope. But it would mean going back, finding another pass. By then, the snows will have closed the high country. We would be trapped until spring. And in spring, there will be 10 times as many soldiers waiting, Whitehawk added. As they watched, a rider separated from the cavalry group below and rode toward them under a white flag. Sarah recognized the figure even at a distance. Jake Morrison, the self-appointed sheriff from Copper Creek, now wearing the blue uniform of a territorial marshal. Mrs. McKenna, Morrison's voice carried clearly in the thin mountain air. I know you're up there. Come down and we can settle this peacefully. What does he want? Asked Running Bear, the youngest of their group. Takoda's expression was grim as he translated Morrison's words for the others. Their response was immediate and unanimous. Raised rifles and hard faces that promised violence if the soldiers tried to advance. Sarah, Takoda said quietly, he's not talking to all of us. Just to you. The implication was clear. Morrison believed he could convince her to abandon her chosen path, to return to the world she had left behind. It was an offer of amnesty, for her alone. I'm not going down there, Sarah said firmly. Maybe you should listen to what he has to say, Takoda replied, though every word seemed to pain him. If there's a chance. No. Sarah's voice cut through the mountain air like a blade. I know exactly what he'll offer. A return to my old life, a pardon for helping you, maybe even a reward for coming to my senses. And all I have to do is watch them kill the man I love. Takoda reached for her hand. Sarah, if staying with me means your death, then I die having lived more fully in these past days than in all the years before. She squeezed his fingers tightly. We made vows, Takoda. I meant every word. Below them, Morrison was growing impatient. You've got 1 hour, Mrs. McKenna. After that, we come up after all of you. Whitehawk said something in Lakota that made the other warriors grin fiercely. Takoda translated, he says Morrison talks like a man whose horse has never climbed above the tree line. Can we fight our way through? Sarah asked. 4 against 20 with a Gatling gun. Takoda shook his head. We might kill half of them, but we would all die in the attempt. They spent precious minutes examining every possible approach to the valley, but the tactical situation was hopeless. The soldiers commanded every route, and their position was too strong to assault. As the sun climbed higher, Sarah could see Morrison checking his pocket watch with increasing frequency. Then Running Bear, who had been scouting along the ridge, returned with news that changed everything. There is another way, he said excitedly in English, one of the few phrases he knew. Dangerous but possible. He led them to a precipitous cliff face that dropped into the valley behind the soldiers' position. What he had found was an old goat trail, barely wide enough for a horse and rider, that zigzagged down the sheer rock face. It would be terrifying, potentially fatal, but it would bring them out well beyond the cavalry's position. The horses will never make it, Whitehawk said after examining the trail. Mine will, Sarah said suddenly. Everyone turned to look at her. My mare, she's sure-footed, bred for mountain work. She can make that descent. Not carrying a rider, Takoda objected. Then I'll lead her down on foot. Sarah was already dismounting, her mind racing through the possibilities. Look, if I can get down there with the rifles and ammunition, I can create a distraction, draw their attention while you find another way around. Absolutely not, Takoda said flatly. I will not let you sacrifice yourself. It's not a sacrifice if it works. Sarah began transferring weapons and supplies to her horse's saddle. You said yourself we can't fight them head-on. But if they're busy chasing one rider, 3 warriors might be able to circle around and hit them from behind. The plan was desperate, dangerous, and likely suicidal. It was also their only hope. Whitehawk studied the cliff face again, then looked at Sarah with something approaching respect. You would do this? Risk everything for people who are not your blood? They became my blood when I chose love over fear, Sarah replied simply. After a fierce, whispered argument, Takoda finally agreed to the plan. They would give Sarah 30 minutes to reach the bottom and get into position. Then they would begin their flanking maneuver, timing their attack to coincide with her distraction. The descent was a nightmare of loose rock and icy patches, with drops that would mean instant death for both horse and rider. Sarah's mare picked her way down with the careful precision of a mountain goat, while Sarah fought vertigo and the constant fear that the next step would be their last. Halfway down, her foot slipped on a patch of ice. For a terrifying moment, she dangled over the abyss, held only by her grip on the mare's reins. The horse braced herself, providing an anchor until Sarah could find her footing again. "Good girl," Sarah whispered, patting the mare's neck with a trembling hand. "We're going to make it." 20 minutes later, she reached the valley floor behind a screen of boulders, her legs shaking from exertion and terror. The soldiers were visible about 400 yards away, their attention focused on the ridge where Morrison continued his increasingly angry demands for surrender. Sarah checked her weapons. Thomas's rifle, fully loaded, plus 2 pistols and plenty of ammunition. She positioned herself behind the largest boulder, took careful aim at the cavalry's horses, and waited for the signal. It came in the form of a war cry that echoed off the canyon walls as Takoda and the others launched their attack from an unexpected quarter. The soldiers wheeled to meet this new threat, and in that moment of confusion, Sarah opened fire. Her first shot dropped the lead horse, sending the Gatling gun crew scrambling. Her second and third shots scattered the cavalry's mounts, creating chaos in their ranks. The soldiers were caught between 2 fires, unable to bring their superior numbers to bear effectively. The battle was brief but vicious. When the gun smoke cleared, half the soldiers were dead or wounded, including Morrison, who lay clutching a shattered shoulder. The survivors had scattered, more concerned with escape than pursuit. Sarah found Takoda kneeling beside Whitehawk, who had taken a bullet in the chest. The old warrior's breathing was labored, but his eyes were clear and fierce. "Did we win?" he asked in English. "We won," Takoda assured him. "The border is open." Whitehawk smiled, then spoke rapidly in Lakota. Takoda nodded solemnly, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. "What did he say?" Sarah asked. "That love proved stronger than fear today, and that you have earned your place among the people." Whitehawk died as the sun touched the western peaks, his face peaceful in the golden light. They buried him on a hilltop overlooking the Promised Land, marking his grave with stones arranged in the ancient way. 2 hours later, as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Sarah and Takoda crossed into Canada. The border was nothing more than an imaginary line, but it might as well have been the entrance to paradise. Behind them lay a world that had no place for their love. Ahead lay uncertainty, hardship, and the challenge of building a new life from nothing, but they would face it together. That night, camped beside a crystal stream with the aurora borealis dancing overhead, Sarah lay in Takoda's arms and marveled at the journey that had brought them here. A week ago, she had been a lonely widow existing from day to day. Now she was a woman who had found love, courage, and a reason to hope for tomorrow. "Do you regret anything?" Takoda asked, echoing her question from days earlier. Sarah looked up at the vast star field above them, at the endless possibilities stretching toward the horizon. "Only that we waited so long to find each other," she whispered. In the distance, wolves howled their ancient songs to the moon. And somewhere beyond the mountains, in a world they had left behind forever, Sarah's empty cabin stood as a monument to the woman she used to be, before love taught her that some arrows, once they find their mark, can heal instead of wound. The frontier had claimed many things from both of them, but in the end it had also given them the greatest gift of all, each other, and a love strong enough to survive anything the world could throw at them. Their real adventure was just beginning.